So we talk about the question of disclosure, and it's funny, I never really saw myself as someone who would talk about UFO disclosure. It was never that way. I got into this field of history. But of course I kept looking at things like the cover-up, and I think inevitably I got pulled into the disclosure question. And now I'm in it, I guess. And I do like to think about it, and I'm curious about it. But when we talk about disclosure, I think a lot of our discussion hinges on the nature of what our political system is. So for example, you go back to the 1950s. There were researchers and activists relating to the UFO phenomenon back then. Sure there were. There was a group called NICAP, which was dedicated, to having, among other things, congressional hearings on the matter of UFOs back in the late 50s and into the 60s. This was one of the biggest issues that they had. They were centered out of Washington, D.C. They were led by a retired Marine Corps Major, Dolan. And it was an important issue. And there were several times when NICAP thought they were going to be able to have congressional hearings. And every time at the last minute, the rug was pulled out from underneath that, and it didn't happen. But in that world, in the world of the late 50s, it's not hard to see that people could believe that congressional hearings was the best way to go. People believed in the American system. We had a situation at the time where people believed that this was a functioning democratic Republican system of government. Congress was the voice of the people. We elected those guys into office, and they were responsive to us. And so that the logical step would have to be have open congressional hearings so that we as a public could discuss this in a proper way. Totally logical way of thinking. And, that attempt was tried. Tried and failed several times in the 50s and 60s, didn't happen. And we've never had congressional hearings since the late 60s. My colleague Stephen Bassett is currently attempting to try to get actual congressional hearings going again. And if he gets it to happen, that would be fabulous. But we haven't had anything for almost 50 years. So that's if we had a functioning system. But what if we don't have a functioning representative system? What if we had a system that, the wheels have basically fallen off? Or as I've often said, it's basically like seeing a dead body on the side of the road. That's our government, that's our country. A dead body, you poke it with a stick, it doesn't move, but you think, well, he's wearing the same clothing he had on last week, so he must be fine. The clothing is our system. The clothing is the offices, the presidency, the Supreme Court, the Congress. The clothing, the appearance, the trappings are the same. Those haven't changed, but fundamentally, inside, everything has changed, and the old system basically is now it's a corpse of a republic, and maybe we can revive it somehow. But right now, it's just not doing very well. It's been transformed. I'll get into that in a minute. But if you don't have a functioning democratic system, then does that affect our strategy for disclosure? If you're living in a kind of system that we might characterize as invisible fascism, invisible because it's not like 1930s Hitler fascism. That was in your face. They would march down the streets, letting you know that it was Ein Reich, Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer. It was very upfront. Or in Stalin's Russia, it was very upfront. It's not really upfront here. It's lessons have been learned. We call it freedom. Give us our Monday Night Football and our Dancing with the Stars, and you just do what you want to do. It's kind of what we have. So I call it invisible fascism. It's invisible because we don't see it. It's not discussed, but it's all the same. So in that type of a situation, what is our political system? I wouldn't necessarily call it fascist exactly the same way as the old system. But I don't really think we've given ourselves the conceptual tools to figure this thing out very well. We're not really talking about it as a society. One thing I ask myself is how much freedom do people have? I think freedom goes in gradation. It's not all or nothing. We can say we have a free society, but I think that's a little simplistic. So we have some freedoms and we have other things where we're not free, and it moves on a spectrum. And I think it's always been like that. So it's just helpful for us to think these questions through. How much freedom do we have in our world today? So with that said, I want to talk about why or how the cover-up works, in my own opinion, particularly in an international manner. Wondered about this for a long time, because we realize the UFO phenomenon is not simply the United States, it's global. So you would ask yourself, well, what's stopping other countries from disclosing the truth? Why wouldn't they? Well, let's talk about that. One of the key things, of course, is secrecy, as we've been talking about. We have black budget agencies, we have the NSA, we have the NRO, that is the National Reconnaissance Office. They manage all of the spy satellites. They are ultra, ultra, ultra secret. There's little question in my mind that any space-based UFO activity, and there is a history of that, is going to be monitored and recorded by the National Reconnaissance Office and by the NSA and probably a host of other black agencies, which their existence may be classified to this day. There's probably, I mean, consider this, the NSA existed in secrecy for well over a decade before it was outed in the mid-60s. The NRO existed in total secrecy for about 30 years. No one knew it existed until around the year 1990 or so. It actually would have been a felony to mention its existence on the floor of Congress up until around 1990. So America has a history, a long history actually, of having large, very sophisticated agencies, the existence of which is not even acknowledged. And you know, back in the early 60s, the NSA very possibly had the best computers in the world. And they were NSA, no such agency. They didn't even officially exist, but they had probably the best computers in the world. So just think about that for a minute.